Welcome to the Parents at Work podcast, a podcast for parents who want to succeed at work while they're also raising children. My name is Louie Mihalich-Levin, and I'm a healthcare lawyer, founder of a program called Mindful Return that helps employers retain their new parent, top talent, and a mama to two wonderful redheaded boys who are now 9 and 11 years old. I am joined today by my co-host and amazing husband, Jason Levin. Jason, welcome.
Good morning, amazing wife, Louie Mihalich-Levin. Thrilled to be here on this wonderful, beautiful day where we can actually walk our children to camp, feeling good. Welcome, everyone. I'm the founder of Ready, Set, Launch, LLC, where I'm a speaker, trainer, and coach. I advise executives on how to grow their professional services practice and make intentional career transitions. My debut book, Relationships to Infinity, The Art and Science of Keeping in Touch, is now available on Amazon and wherever you find books online.
Awesome, Jason. So this month on the Parents at Work podcast, we're interviewing moms and dads who are diversity professionals. And if you haven't already listened to our conversation with the two amazing moms in DEI, Jaya Saxena and Kamila Knight, you should definitely do that. We are now turning our attention to dads in diversity and equity and inclusion. Over to you, Jason, to introduce our fabulous dad guest for today.
Thanks so much, Lori. And it is a pleasure to introduce Ken Emo. Ken Emo is the global head of diversity and inclusion for Adobe. Ken is an accomplished executive, author, lawyer, and U.S. Air Force Judge Advocate General Corps veteran who promotes organizational change through diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other strategic human capital initiatives. Ken is a proud husband to his wife, Jennifer, and there are 3 girls, Olivia, who is 15, 12-year-old twins, Cecelia and Juliette, and 2 dogs. So their first dog was Julio Jones. And then during COVID, they got a COVID puppy, Sir Lewis Hamilton, also known as Louie. He was a 4-year scholar athlete at Southern Methodist University and received his law degree from Wake Forest University School of Law. Ken, welcome to the Parents at Work podcast.
Jason, Lori, thank you so much for having me. This is I'm really excited to be here.
Really happy to have you. So, Ken, the very first thing that we'd love to have you do, and we ask all of our guests this, is to tell us a little bit about your own personal working parent story, please.
So, as you mentioned in the introduction, so thank you for that. Very kind words. I really appreciate that. My story begins also with my wife's story. We both work outside of the home. And so we're raising these 3 amazing daughters, 15-year-old Olivia, our 12-year-old twins, Cecelia and Juliette. It's a constant juggle. I think, what's good about it is that we're setting, I think, a pretty good example in the home with our daughters as to how you sort of navigate our personal and professional lives and trying to set some pretty clear boundaries. We don't always get it right. Things can be a bit of a challenge, but we're very present for our daughters with some of their, activities outside the home. And I think it also helps that with the jobs that we have, our daughters see that in us, we're also motivated by purpose. And so, leading diversity, equity, and inclusion for several years is a job that is, has its challenges, quite frankly. And we're really trying to address big systemic issues. And I like to look at the work that I do as an extension of the civil rights movement. We're just calling it diversity, equity, and inclusion. So these are obviously issues that the country, society, the workplace have been trying to address for generations, decades. Some would even say centuries. And I'm able to share that with my children and why this work is important to me. And so I think that's something that they value and appreciate, especially as they get older, more so with my 15-year-old than with the twins, because she's very aware of the issues and she asks a lot of really good questions that, quite frankly, I think actually make me better at what I do because I'm being sort of probed and prodded by my daughter who represents Gen Z. So I have to be mindful of that as well. So it's a work in progress. And I think it's something that is, sort of navigating what I do and being a parent. It's a work in progress. And it's something that I don't think will ever be complete. I'm constantly sort of working at this issue and at these issues and trying to be better.
I think parenthood is a gigantic work in progress. There is no final destination finish line. I really am inspired by your description of the DEI work as an extension of the civil rights movement. Thank you for that analogy, Ken. And you've already sort of gone in this direction, but I'm curious to know whether there's anything in particular that you think describes what it's like to be a working parent in the DEI space that might be generalizable to other people who are working parents also doing the type of work that you do.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things as a working parent in the DEI space is sometimes it's hard to turn work off. And I think regardless of what you do, you should be able to turn work off. However, in the past 2.5 years, or just what the country has gone through with, COVID initially and sort of the xenophobia that accompanied COVID, the Asian community being targeted as a result of COVID. And then obviously with all the social unrest issues that started in some respects with the murder of George Floyd and so many other terrible, tragic events involving African-American people at the hands of law enforcement. It was almost as if there was this collective epiphany for some people in our country that things just aren't right. To have children growing up in this world who are old enough to tune into social media or, have conversations with some of their friends about these things that they're experiencing, and then having these conversations with us, my wife and my girlfriend and I in the house, made it such that we couldn't turn this off. And there were certain conversations that I had to have with my children that, quite frankly, I didn't want to have now. It's one of those things that as they get older, we can talk about racial unrest and other terrible issues that the country dealt with. But the past 2 years accelerated everything. And because of that, I never felt like I could really turn this off, turn work off, because I'm constantly having these conversations with my children about what's going on externally. And then there were conversations around, sadly, some of the conversations my parents had with me when I was a kid around people started talking about the talk, and the talk being, conversations that Black parents have with their children to, quite frankly, make sure that they're going to come home safely after going out, wherever they may be going. I had those discussions with my parents when I was younger. I had it with them. They had those conversations with me when I was around the time that I was old enough to drive. And so let's say 15, 16 years old. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, child of the 80s and 90s. I'm having these conversations with my children before they can drive.
Yeah.
I'm having these conversations, as I said before, my oldest is 15. So this was 2 years ago. So I'm having these conversations with my 13 and 10-year-old children. It's a sad state of affairs, but at the same time, I also feel like I'm arming my kids for basic self-preservation in the world. That made things a little difficult because I was constantly thinking about, what's best for my kids, also in the context of what I do, and also thinking about it through the lens of, how can I be even better and more effective at work, by sharing some of these stories. But sharing stories isn't enough. And also thinking, what are some of the big changes that can be made to address these issues within the workplace, and literally sort of harnessing the energy in this collective epiphany that I referenced before to ensure we can make some real change.
And real change that will benefit those children that we were just talking about, right? Whenever they're coming up through the workforce. Ken, I just have to reflect that the words you used a moment ago about talking about you knew you were going to have these conversations and you wanted to, but just maybe not now, not yet, not at this age, was almost verbatim, word for word, what Kamila Knight said. She's DEI at Danaher on our mom podcast as well. So I'm certain that this is a real prevalent theme. I want to sneak in one last question before I pass the baton over to Jason, which is, in this world where you can't turn off for many reasons, what do you do to reset and restore yourself? Because it's impossible to go 24/7, 365 without taking a break, right?
That's a great question. I love that you asked that question, because something I often tell people, who report into me, or people I work with, or just friends and colleagues generally, is really to prioritize self-care. And if you don't take care of yourself first, you can't take care of anybody else. So I'm a huge proponent of exercise. I work out quite a bit. And exercise for me, as I've gotten older, I've sort of redefined exercise. And for me, it's essentially anything I do that requires physical exertion. So harder exercise.
Large changes, yes.
Exactly. I'm big into cycling, so I'm on the Peloton bike, have other, pieces of workout equipment in my basement that I use regularly. But I've got these two dogs that you mentioned before, Julio Jones and Louie, and I love to take them on walks. One of the things that I love to do with my dogs is early on a Saturday morning, as the sun is rising, take them out and walk around, our town. I live in Northern Virginia. Walk around our town here and just, I find peace in those moments because it's usually just me and the dogs. And this may sound somewhat cheesy, but I just love watching the sunrise and just being outside and sort of being a part of nature and listening to a podcast as I'm doing that with the dogs. I'm big into podcasts and I like sports, so podcasts that are sports related, podcasts that have comedic in nature.
Yes.
So it's things really just to take my mind off of work. And then when I'm home, just spending time with Jen and the girls and just, listening to music, which is something we love to do in our family. And my wife and I love watching, different shows. And so I'm always trying to find things to disconnect. Now, I will say that while it's hard to turn it off, I do turn it off, though. I'm very intentional in turning things off. And what I find is that, especially over the past 2.5 years, people would want to talk to me more about what I did sort of in social settings. And that was probably the most difficult thing, because I don't necessarily want to talk about work outside of work, but I also recognize that people were sort of craving to hear and learn more about these issues. So that was a little more challenging in social settings. And quite frankly, we weren't getting together that much with the pandemic anyway, but I did find that it was a little more challenging then. Like I said, just the bottom line things, I am very intentional in carving out time for myself to get my mind off of work and some of these issues that we're all dealing with.
And that's so important for sustainability and being able to make an impact over the long term. And rather than being cheesy, I think the morning sunrise walk with the dogs is a beautiful image, and one that when I heard it in my head when you described it, and I felt my whole nervous system just calm down, right? I mean, even imagining that scene is one that can help us to relax and put ourselves in a better place. Jason, over to you. Next questions.
I love, Ken, how you're talking about self-care. Your intentions are actually founded in social science. One, being in and around nature and being present is been proven to be calming. And then two, the commitment to laughter and comedy is also calming. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the comedians in cars getting coffee. The fact that you're putting on your own oxygen mask first is absolutely fantastic. I also identify with your redefinition of exercise at our ripe young ages. I don't run as much. I've gotten more on the bicycle and swimming. So I think it's great how you're both taking care of yourself, and that's allowing you to do the important work that you're doing. You've lived multiple lives. You've been in the JAG Corps. You've been a practicing attorney, transition to being a DEI professional within AmLaw 100 law firms, and now a DEI exec within Fortune 500. As you've evolved, what workplace support or benefit did you find helpful as you became a working parent?
I think the workplace has evolved quite a bit in the 20 years that I've been working. I took advantage of all the available benefits. I'll just put that out there for sure. One of the things that I really appreciated was parental leave. It's an obvious one, but there was also a time, and as I said at the outset, my oldest is 15. There was a time that while parental leave was available for men and women, I just remember being in conversations with other men who almost wore it as a badge of honor that they didn't take parental leave. People telling stories of, when my wife had our children, I was in the hospital for the birth of my child, and then I went back to work and I didn't take any vacation. So
it still happens, Ken. It still happens, sadly.
Why am I not surprised? Why am I not surprised by that? And people wore that as a badge of honor. I remember thinking, well, I'm going to take my leave, which I did. But the thing that I'm not proud of is that I would have to leave the office early occasionally to pick my kids up from daycare. And I literally felt like I was sneaking out of the office just because I needed to get there before 6:00, before the place closed down. And I felt like I was always one of the last parents to arrive. And that's because at that time, it just felt like, almost a sign of weakness to be a dad who's an involved parent. So that's obviously not a good thing. I think things have changed. I hope things have changed quite a bit from 15 years ago. I've also taken advantage of some of the financial benefits. And those are, some from the standpoint of, I hate that I'm forgetting what it's called now, but the benefits around, sort of pre-tax benefits you can put toward childcare. So we definitely took advantage of those things, but parental leave was huge. I think more than anything, than any benefit though, is having worked with managers, leaders, men and women who made me feel as though I shouldn't feel guilty for being a hands-on dad. And again, I think that's evolved over time. And again, a lot of men, as I said before, sort of wore it as a badge of honor to sort of, I don't want to say not be hands-on, but, to really be uber focused on work. And so just having leaders that I worked with who basically said, yeah, go do your thing. Don't let your children be the last one to at daycare, go. And that wasn't everybody, but there were certainly a few folks who I worked with, leaders who are really good in that way. And I try to replicate those folks. Granted, we're all in this remote environment now, so we have to lead in a different way when it comes to these things, and really being flexible when, you see people's children or their pets in the video, but, just letting people know that it's okay. Like, this is just work. The most important job that I have, I'm going to speak for myself here. The most important job that I have is being a husband to Jennifer and a father to those 3 girls I keep talking about today. And so, the work stuff will be here, but my time with my kids, as they are rapidly getting older, it's finite from the standpoint that it's, they're going to grow up and they're going to go off to college and they're going to leave. They'll always come back, but it will never be like how it is right now when we're always together. Now, I'm saying that as I'm sitting in my house by myself with my kids at camp. But, even with them being away at camp for 2 weeks, that puts things in perspective, because it wasn't that long ago where they weren't doing sleepaway camp. And now they're 5 years into this thing and they absolutely love it, which obviously is a good thing. But it also sends the message to me that, when they're ready to leave, they're going to be ready. I think we're trying to prepare them. And it's going to be one of the hardest days of my life when my kids are going off to school. So we can't get this time back. Anything that allows us to effectively do our jobs and effectively do our most important jobs, and that is parenting, we should take full advantage of any benefits that allow us to do that.
Ken, I think it is outstanding that you're modeling wonderful behavior in taking leave. And I think you're hitting on something that is extremely important. And you articulating, how others see it as a badge of honor that, I was there for the birth and then I went back to work, and how you've grounded yourself in being both a husband and a father, I think is fantastic. And also, Lori likes to talk about hitting the leadership lottery, that you had supportive leaders in your own organization that allowed you and supported you to do so. Kudos to you, Ken.
This episode of the Parents at Work podcast is brought to you by Ready, Set, Launch, a boutique career coaching firm that supports executives in career and retirement transitions, as well as building their professional services practices. I'm Jason Levin, and I've been supporting executives achieving their goals in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors for the past 10 years. Based on those experiences, I decided to write a book called Relationships to Infinity: The Art and Science of Keeping in Touch. We say keep in touch, but we struggle to do so. I wrote this book so that my readers could have proven research-based tactics to keep in touch and reap all the benefits. I'm excited about this book, and I know that you will too. Head over to readysetlaunch.net or connect with me on LinkedIn to learn more about the book. Be happy to learn more about your goals and your organization and how there might be a fit. Again, head over to readysetlaunch.net to get back in touch. Now, back to our episode.
So as you're talking about supports and benefits that you had and you took, let's flip it to the other side. What support or benefit didn't you have, but you think other parents might benefit from?
What support or benefit did not have? When I think about some of the benefits that are available today, like we've certainly evolved. Things have certainly gotten better. I think what not to overgeneralize it, but I think what companies could do a better job of in some companies is advertising those benefits and really encouraging people to take advantage of those things. Talk about leave as an example. And I'm not going to tell you or the audience anything you don't already know, but when you compare Americans to other Westerners, American employees to other Westerners, we underutilize our PTO. Why is that? What's the culture behind the fact that we've got it in our heads that we can't take adequate time off? Again, back to this badge of honor. It's almost like, I didn't use all my PTO. I got a bunch of time left over. So people start figuring out how they can roll stuff over into the next year. Whereas if you didn't take it the previous year, what makes you think you're going to use it all the following year? You're not. So you're going to keep trying to roll things over. So why is that? So I think it's advertising, really marketing the benefits you have, encouraging people to use it, and sending the message to folks that we'll figure things out. It will go on, and that's not a bad, work will go on. And that's not a bad thing against you. In fact, that's what we want. That's what we need, and that it's okay. I'm trying to think of other benefits that would have been great.
I want to just hop in on the advertising front and tell a little story that, I was working as a partner at a law firm, and I did not know for the first 18 months that I worked there that there was a backup care benefit that I was able to use when, my kids were sick and I needed somebody to look after my kids. As soon as I found out, of course, I started using it, but I couldn't believe that these types of things aren't included in the onboarding package and they're not, widely distributed. People need to get the word out. So I'm on board with that recommendation.
It's funny, Louie, about the backup daycare. So I've worked at a couple of places that have had that, which was a great benefit. But what I found challenging about using it was that you had to go through, my experience only at some places that will remain nameless, you had to go through some of the same bureaucratic things to get in that you went through at your own daycare. And so my thought was, if it was good enough for my own daycare, is it not enough for me just to sort of submit the paperwork and everything that we had to go through for the daycare that we use for the on-site daycare? So I felt like it was unnecessarily cumbersome. And I'm sure there's a reason for that, but I just found that benefit was difficult to use.
Well, I'll just offer that we never actually use the on-site backup daycare, but in a lot of places, you don't face the same administrative bureaucracies if you have the nanny come to your home type of backup daycare, which is usually an option with all of those standardized backup care. We just called in whenever something happened and we couldn't get childcare, and someone would show up at our house. And now one of us would often work from home since we didn't know the person, et cetera. But still, it gave us another set of hands on deck. But yeah, I agree with you on the administrative burden of filling out all the forms of vaccinations and all that stuff for the on-site. But the in-home one helped us out a lot.
I'll echo what Ken was talking about in terms of taking PTO, and bravo for taking a vacation. And I agree with you. I lived in France for 5 years. Actually, Lori and I met in France. There was a culture of taking your vacation. When I lived in Paris, people would even say to me, it's amazing in the US how, in the first 5 questions, you get asked, what do you do? Living in France, one of the first 5 questions that you get is either, what do you do in your free time? What was your last vacation? Or what are you thinking about for your next vacation? So there's just this culture around making sure that people have hobbies and people have free time and those kinds of things. I'm thrilled that you brought that up. You've talked a little bit about your own evolution Parents are Nigerian, and you were growing up in Texas. I want to go back to Ken as a middle schooler or a high schooler. I'm going to bring my inner career coach out. I'm just curious, what was your first ever paying job? And when you think about your first ever paying job, flash forward, what career-related skills do you think helped you grow because of that?
I love that question. My first ever paying job, I used to wash cars in the neighborhood, and I was 12 or 13.
With the big squeezy sponge?
I'll tell you a big sponge and towels. Probably not the best car washing experience for my customers, but I'll tell you a quick story, and then I'll transition into sort of this car washing gig that I did with my brother, who's 13 months younger than I. One of the things that my parents taught us was just the importance of just hard work generally, and if you want something, just figure out how to work to get it. I was in love with Air Jordan sneakers when I was a kid. And so one of the things I did to get some Jordans was, and my parents weren't going to spend money on J's because they were really expensive then, as they continue to be now. And my folks, they were like, no, I'm not spending that kind of money on sneakers. So what my brother and I did was we just saved up our lunch money and bought shoes. So this was back in the day when layaway was, at least in my experience, was very prevalent, and we just bought stuff on layaway. So I put these shoes on layaway for 10 weeks, would go to the mall every Friday, give them a few bucks, and just literally sort of, see that balance chip away. And I eventually got the shoes. Well, I got those shoes at the expense of not eating lunch for several weeks, which obviously was not a good.
Wow. Wow.
And I hid it from my parents because they would have thought it was foolish that my brother and I were saving up our lunch money to buy shoes. So we hid that from them. And then my brother and I decided, you know what, we gotta make some money, man. This is ridiculous. We have to eat and we need to earn money. So we were fortunate enough to have some neighbors who allowed us to wash their cars regularly. And they just sort of paid us, we didn't have a set fee. They just sort of paid us out of the kindness of their hearts. And they were quite generous, and generous to me as a 12, 13-year-old kid was like $10, and sometimes it would be like $20. So that was a lot of money.
Back then, that's a lot of money.
And, what I learned from that experience is two things. One, if you really want something, you got to figure out how to get it. And that was me saving up my lunch money to get the shoes. And that was me figuring out, okay, this is not the best approach. So maybe I should figure out another way to make money. The second thing was, you got to keep your word, right? So I would schedule a time for when we're going to wash these cars, and they would make their cars available, and they'd, back them down the driveway, and we'd get out and wash their cars. The third thing that I learned from that was that, I did my best to wash those cars and do the best job that I could. Our customers would come behind us and sort of point out some spots that needed a little additional work, and we'd, clean those up for them. But the other thing that I learned from that is when you're in a position to help someone else, do what you can to help them. That was what our neighbors did for us. They saw that my brother and I were working hard to make a little bit of extra money so we could have a little bit of, financial independence at a young age. And while they could have gone to have their cars detailed at, some of the best car washing and detailing places around, or they could have done it on their own, and it would have been a lot better, they allowed us to do that. And that's something I'm going to be forever grateful to. And that sort of relates to my job today. So much of what I do now is about helping others, really being intentional in how I can help people sort of on the individual level, how I can help organizations on a group level from a D&I perspective, and how I can help organizations at a systemic level. Granted, I'm getting paid for this work, obviously, but I think central to it is the importance of service. And I think when you look at my career trajectory over the past 20 years, it started in service and being, a JAG officer in the United States Air Force, where I learned so much about the importance of leadership and so much about the importance of followership. And one of the things that that stays with me from that with the Air Force is the Air Force's core values, which is integrity first, service before self, and excellence in everything you do. And those are things that I've been out of the Air Force now for 16 years. It's amazing how life happens, the way time flies. But I can quote those Air Force core values without hesitation. And I think the reason why I can is because it really speaks to my experience personally, what I've learned from my parents and the great mentors and other folks that I've been fortunate to have in my life, and how I just try to approach my work professionally as well. So I think so much of that does sort of tie back to the early days of trying to get a job so I can go about getting a better way to find some J's so I didn't have to starve for it. But I love that question, Jason.
That's awesome, Ken. And I love that your brother and you were so ingenious. So you were skipping lunch. You must have been really hungry at dinner. Your parents must have been saying, what's going on here?
That's so funny. When I was younger, I had a really big appetite. And so they were probably like, you're eating a lot more than usual right now.
That's amazing. And I like how you think about it in terms of service and helping others. And so important to make those positive ripples, that you were the benefit of those positive ripples. You remembered that, and now you're intentional about doing that in your own world, both professionally and personally. So bravo.
This next question also relates to service, Ken. As a dad who's advancing diversity in the workplace, what do you see as your role in shaping the conversation around working parenthood?
I think it's similar to my role in advancing D&I generally, and that is to have really honest conversations about what some of the challenges are. Those conversations are evolving. It's so funny, when I think about these issues and sort of this work generally, when I started off by saying, a lot of this work is an extension of the civil rights movement. While we made a lot of progress on some of the issues that, the civil rights movement sought to advance, generations, decades ago, some of the original issues still exist, right? So we haven't solved all that. And then on top of that, there are new issues that we're contending with because things are constantly evolving. One being sort of the trans issues in the workplace and in society generally. I think the same goes to issues facing working parents. And I think what we have seen in this COVID era in which we're in is, okay, now that we're in a hybrid environment, how do we effectively navigate the workplace for everyone? But since we're talking about working parents, how do we also help working parents navigate the workplace? When there was a lot of concerns about beginning of COVID, around the she-cession and the disproportionate impact of COVID on women, on working women, on women that also happen to be moms, but women generally. What could we do to create a workforce that was more inclusive of women when there was this fear that we're going to lose a lot of the gains that we made in increased women participation in the workforce? And, early signs seem to indicate that we're going to go backwards. And so I think, one of the things that we have to do, sort of my role in this space, is helping organizations continue to be vigilant and creative in how we foster a more inclusive environment where you're going to have some people in the office, you're going to have some people at home, you're going to have, some people, with tons of resources at their disposal to help them effectively navigate the challenges facing us, and some people who are going to have limited resources. It's almost as if, while we're going through COVID, we're all sort of going through the storm together, but we are all in different ships, different boats going through it. And some people are in boats that are, can handle rougher seas a little better, and others are in boats that can't, right? And so I think it really calls for, one, honest conversations around the disparate impact of how we're all addressing this, facing these issues. And two, really being creative in how we come up with solutions to these issues. So I think my role is to, one, be the facilitator of the honest conversation. Two, do it in a way to where I'm also sharing my own experiences. I think people really crave authentic conversations and leaders who are so comfortable in their skin that they're willing to say that, you know what, I'm having a hard time too. And here are some of the challenges that I'm facing. So, me being willing to put myself out there. And 3, then really getting the wisdom of the crowd to figure out how we can be creative in addressing some of these challenges in a way that's, helpful for working parents, but also mindful of the fact that there are a lot of folks who aren't working parents, but are also in the workplace who are struggling as well.
Absolutely. I really appreciate your modeling of that vulnerability. And also, vigilant and creative are 2 amazing words that we all need to focus on.
Final questions for Ken. So, lightning round. Ken, 3 questions in 1. What's your number 1 piece of advice for navigating life as a working parent, your number 1 book, and your number 1 piece of technology? So, number 1 piece of advice for navigating life as a working parent, number 1 book, and number 1 piece of technology.
The number 1 piece of advice: vigilance, persistence, self-care, disconnect. Number 1 book that I'm reading right now. I read a great book. Again, this is me, disconnecting from my everyday, but also have an interest in sports, history, stuff like that generally. I just read this great book by Malcolm Gladwell called The Bomber Mafia. And it's about innovation during World War II, the lead up to World War II, around how to create precision bombing to make war a little more humane. Whereas before, the approach was just, dropping a bunch of bombs indiscriminately and hoping that it hits military targets, but not really caring that much if it hits civilians. And the thought by some really creative, engineers and other experts and Air Force leaders was, if we could create precision bombs, it would reduce the number of civilian casualties. So Gladwell tells us really incredible story about the work that was necessary to do that. I'm not going to give anything away, but it's definitely worth the read. I thoroughly enjoyed it and read it around the 4th of July, sort of ran through that book. What's awesome about it is that it really gets into technology, which brings me to your 3rd question. Piece of technology I'm using right now is, as I said at the outset, I'm really into physical fitness. So I got a tonal and piece of workout equipment that you can literally put on your wall. You got to have experts install it. And I got some of this stuff in home as a result of COVID. But what's fascinating about the tonal, it is literally like having a piece of machine learning in your home. As I work out on it, it can tell me when it can detect when I'm getting a little weaker in my exercise. So it has this thing called automatic assist. It gives me tips on how to do the movements correctly. And this is all happening in real time. And then it tracks the progress of my workouts over time. So I can go back and look at the data and see where I need to improve, or quite frankly, see how I'm tracking over time. So that piece of technology and that piece of equipment is incredible. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And just a quick aside, I recently had foot surgery, so I'm limited in some of the activities I can do on that, but I'm able to find workouts that allow me to work around the limitations I have from foot surgery. So it's just been a great piece of technology that's literally in my basement.
That is amazing, Ken. Fascinating responses to this question. And as a fellow fan of Malcolm Gladwell, I have not read The Bomber Mafia, so I need to definitely pick that up. And positive healing thoughts in your direction as you recover from foot surgery. So, Lori, I'll let you close it out.
Thank you so much, Ken, for coming on to the podcast and sharing your story. I'm like sitting here Googling tonal because I have not heard of this. So now I see what it looks like. And yes, it does look like it needs to be properly mounted to the wall. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Really, really grateful to you for your time and your wisdom and everything that you shared today. To everyone who's listening today, thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this conversation, would you leave us a review on whatever spot you found the podcast? Also, would you share it with a friend? If you know a DEI professional, also consider sharing both this episode and the Moms in DEI episode that was recently released. And we will see you all next time. Thanks so much for joining us on the Parents at Work podcast.